Invitation was sitting on my kitchen table for 11 days before I touched it. Not because I hadn't seen it. I walked past it every morning when I went to put the kettle on. I saw it every night when I turned off the light above the stove. It was a cream-colored envelope with my daughter's handwriting on the front, neat, slanted letters, the same way she'd written since grade 4, and I already knew what was inside before I opened it. I'm 71 years old. I know when I'm being told something without being told something. My name is Loretta. I live in a small bungalow in Barrie, Ontario, the same house I've lived in for 34 years. I bought it with my late husband when we were both still young enough to think a mortgage was an adventure. He passed in 2011, pancreatic cancer, 14 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I stayed in the house because selling felt like erasing the last thing we built together, and because I genuinely had nowhere else I wanted to be. My daughter Melissa is 38. She's a marketing director at a tech firm in Toronto. She drives a Volvo and vacations in Portugal and uses words like curated and intentional when she talks about her life. I'm not saying that to be unkind. She worked hard for everything she has. I watched her do it. I helped her do it in every way I knew how. Her husband's name is Connor. They met in university, got married 6 years ago at a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake. It was a beautiful wedding. I paid for part of it, not because they asked exactly, but because they mentioned the venue cost more than they'd budgeted, and I had some savings from my years working as an office administrator at the school board, and what else was I going to do with it? I thought that was the kind of thing mothers did. I still think that. The baby shower was 18 months ago. I drove down from Barrie on a Saturday morning in February, highway slick from the overnight freeze, because Melissa mentioned the nursery glider was expensive and I wanted to contribute something real, something she'd use every day. I spent $460 at a baby boutique on Yonge Street. The glider was cream-colored with wooden arms. It matched the crib they'd already bought. Melissa hugged me and said it was exactly what she'd wanted. That was the last time I felt fully welcome in her house. Things shifted after the baby came. Slowly at first, the way ice forms on a window. You don't notice until the glass is completely covered. Connor's mother, Patricia, started coming over from Mississauga 3 or 4 times a week. She'd already retired from her position at a law firm. She had a car that started in the cold and energy I'd stopped having somewhere in my mid-60s, and she was available in all the ways I was not, living 90 minutes north in a house that required its own upkeep. I came when I was invited. I tried not to come when I wasn't. Last September, Melissa called to ask if I could babysit on a Friday. I said of course I'd rearrange my knitting group and drive down Thursday night to be ready. She said actually, Patricia could do it, never mind. I said that was fine. It was fine. I told myself it was fine. But I started to notice a pattern. The small exclusions. The birthday dinner for Connor that I heard about after the fact. The Christmas Eve gathering at their house that was just immediate family, which apparently meant his parents but not me. I mentioned it to my friend Heloise once. She's my oldest friend. We've known each other since our children were in junior kindergarten together. And she said, "Loretta, you need to say something." I said I didn't know how. The truth is, I was afraid of what Melissa would say back. When you've given someone everything you have, there's a particular terror in asking them to account for it. The envelope sat on my kitchen table for 11 days. I opened it on a Wednesday evening in March, after supper, when the light in the kitchen was turning that pale gray color it gets in late winter. Inside was a printed card, formal, the kind you'd send to a colleague or a neighbor, not your mother. It was an invitation to my granddaughter Wren's first birthday party. Wren! They'd named her that, a small bird, I'd loved it immediately. Was turning 1 on the 22nd of April. The party was on the Saturday. Brunch style, the card said. 10 in the morning. There was a handwritten note tucked behind the card, Melissa's handwriting again. Mom, just to let you know, the party is mostly Connor's family and their friends from the city. It'll be a bit overwhelming. You might not enjoy it. Maybe we could do something separate with you, just the 3 of us, the week after? I read it twice. Then I set it down on the table and went and stood at the kitchen window for a long time. The backyard was still brown from winter. The bird feeder I put up after my husband died was empty. I'd forgotten to fill it in January, and then kept forgetting. The neighbor's maple was just starting to show the first faint redness in its branches. "You might not enjoy it." That was the sentence I kept coming back to. Not a question, not even, honestly, a statement about me. It was a conclusion she'd already reached on my behalf, and the invitation was courtesy, an afterthought, the way you invite someone to something knowing they won't come. I thought about calling her. I rehearsed it a dozen times in the shower, while I drove to the grocery store on Dunlop Street, while I sat in the Tim Hortons on Essa Road drinking a medium coffee I didn't particularly want. I played out the conversation every possible way, and every version ended the same, with Melissa getting defensive, with me backing down, with nothing changing and me feeling worse. So I didn't call. What I did instead was go to the party. I didn't tell her I was coming. I know how that sounds. I've turned it over many times in the months since, and I still land in the same place. I had the right to be there. She is my grandchild, the first one I'll probably ever have. I held her the morning she came home from the hospital, sat in the glider I'd bought, and she slept on my chest for 2 hours while Melissa rested and Connor went to get groceries. 2 hours. I memorized every part of her face. I wasn't going to miss her first birthday. I drove down from Barrie on a Saturday morning in April. Clear sky. Cold still, the way April is in Ontario. You think spring has arrived and then you step outside and it hasn't, quite. I wore my good coat, the navy wool one I'd bought 3 winters ago when I was still working. I'd had my hair set on Thursday. I wore the pearl earrings my husband gave me for our 25th anniversary. I wasn't trying to be noticed. I just didn't want to look like someone who needed to apologize for being there. I parked around the corner from their house on purpose. I'd thought about this, whether it was strange that I'd thought about this, planned it out so carefully, and decided it wasn't. I was protecting myself. I had a right to that too. I walked to the end of the street and waited. It was a bit past 10:30 when I went to the door. Late enough that the party would be settled, the chaos of arrival over, people with drinks in their hands and children beginning to run between rooms. I rang the bell. Connor answered. He looked at me for just a second longer than normal. Something crossed his face. I couldn't say what exactly, not unkindness, more like recalculation. Then he said, "Loretta, come in," and stepped aside. The house was full. There must have been 30 people, adults clustered in the kitchen and living room, small children orbiting between them, balloons tied to the stair railing, a long table with a pink and cream cake in the center shaped like a bird's nest. Wren's theme, I gathered. Birds. I almost laughed, standing in the doorway. I saw Melissa across the room. She was talking to a woman I didn't recognize, laughing, her dark hair down around her shoulders. She looked beautiful. She looked like someone who had built a life exactly the way she'd planned it. I felt a complicated thing, standing there, love and grief and something harder to name, a feeling like watching someone through a window. She saw me. The laugh didn't leave her face all at once. It faded, the way a radio station fades when you drive past the range. She said something to the woman beside her, touched her arm briefly, and walked toward me. She said, "Mom, that was all?" I said, "I wanted to see Ren on her birthday. That's all I'm here for. I won't stay long." She stood there for a moment. I could see her deciding something. Then she nodded and said, "She's in the living room." I found Ren in the middle of the floor, surrounded by torn wrapping paper and the cardboard innards of boxes. A yellow rubber duck gripped in both hands. She had a small frosting stain on the collar of her white dress. When she saw me, she raised both arms up, the duck still in her fist, and said something that wasn't quite a word but meant absolutely everything. I sat on the floor with her, in my good coat and my pearl earrings, on the hardwood floor beside the coffee table with the balloons and the noise and all of Connor's family looking on. I sat down on the floor and played with my granddaughter. Patricia came over at one point. Connor's mother. And she was kind, actually. She said, "She's been pointing at the door all morning. We couldn't figure out who she was waiting for." I didn't know what to say to that. I just nodded. I stayed for 40 minutes. I didn't speak much to Melissa. When I got up to leave, I went to find her in the kitchen, and I said, "Thank you for letting me stay." She said, "Of course." The drive home to Barrie was 90 minutes on the 400. I didn't put on the radio. I drove in silence most of the way, past Cookstown and Bradford, the flat fields on either side still winter brown, and I thought about my life in the way you only do when you're alone in a car on a long highway. I thought about what I had given. Not to feel sorry for myself. I want to be clear about that. I gave because I wanted to. I paid Melissa's tuition at Ryerson because I believed in her and I could manage it mostly. I lent her and Connor money when they bought the house. $40,000, which they said they pay back and haven't, which I've never once mentioned because I don't want money to be the thing between us. I drove to Toronto when the baby was sick with croup in November and sat in the emergency room at Sick Kids from midnight until 5 in the morning because Melissa was exhausted and Connor had a presentation the next day. I gave because that's what you do. I still believe that. But I had started to understand something, somewhere around Bradford, with the radio off and the fields going by, that giving and belonging are not the same thing. You can give everything you have to another person and still be made to feel like a guest in their life. And at some point, I didn't know exactly when the point was, only that I had clearly passed it. You have to decide what to do with that understanding. I called Howie's when I got home, told her everything, the note in the envelope, the drive down, sitting on the floor with Ren. She listened without interrupting, which is a skill most people don't have. When I finished, she said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to stop waiting to be included." She said, "What does that mean?" I said, "I don't know yet, but something." The something took shape over the following weeks. The first thing I did was call a financial advisor. Not a dramatic gesture, just something I'd been putting off for 2 years. His name was Douglas. He worked out of an office on Bayfield Street, and he asked me a series of questions that made me think harder about my future than I had in a long time. By the end of the conversation, I had a clearer picture: my pension from the school board, my RRSP, the equity in the house. It was enough. Not lavish, but enough. Enough that I had options I hadn't been letting myself consider. The second thing I did was call my lawyer. I'd made my will years ago. Left everything to Melissa, evenly split if there were grandchildren. It was a document written by someone who assumed the future would look like the past. I told the lawyer I wanted to revise it. He didn't ask why. Lawyers, in my experience, generally don't. I added a trust for Ren, direct to her for education accessible at 18. I reduced what would go to Melissa by roughly a third and directed that portion to a women's shelter on Collier Street that I'd been donating small amounts to for years. My husband had believed in it. I did too. I'm not telling you this to seem righteous. I'm telling you because the act of doing it made something shift in me, a kind of realignment. Like when a chiropractor adjusts something you didn't know was out of place and suddenly you're standing differently. The third thing I did was sign up for a watercolor class at the Barrie Public Library. I know how that sounds, but I want you to understand, I had wanted to do this for 7 years. My husband used to paint oils, nothing serious, just weekend afternoons in the garage with music on. And after he died, I'd thought about it, and then not done it, the way you don't do things you've privately associated with grief. The class met Tuesday evenings. The instructor was a woman named Gwen who was somewhere in her 50s and laughed very easily and made everyone feel like a beginner was exactly the right thing to be. The first night I walked in, I was nervous. I sat at the end of a long folding table beside a woman who turned out to be 68 and recently divorced, and learning, she said, to do things for herself for the first time in 40 years. Her name was Sylvie. We went for tea afterward at a place on Dunlop and talked for 2 hours. I drove home that night, and the house didn't feel as quiet as it usually did. Melissa called in May. Not about anything particular, or so she said. She asked how I was. I said, "Fine." She told me about a work project. I told her about the watercolor class. She was quiet for a second, and then she said, "I didn't know you painted." I said, "I'm learning." There was another silence, and in it I felt the weight of all the things we hadn't said to each other. I've been her mother for 38 years. I know her silences the way I know the sound of her car in the driveway. She said, "I'm sorry about the party, Mom." I didn't rush to fill the silence that followed. I used to do that, leap in to say it's fine, don't worry, I understand. But I let the words sit. I let her feel the weight of them. Then I said, "I know." She said, "Connor's mother is she's around a lot, and it's easier, and I know that's not fair." I said, "No, it isn't." Another silence. Then she said, "I'd like to bring Ren up to Barrie this summer, if that's okay." I said, "Of course it's okay. It's always okay." And I meant that. I mean it still. But something had changed in the conversation. In me. Underneath it. I wasn't asking to be included anymore. I wasn't adjusting myself to fit a space she'd decided was the right size for me. I was inviting her into my life, and the difference between those two things, though it might sound small, was the difference between standing in a doorway and standing in a room. Ren came to Barrie in July. 3 days. We walked along the waterfront and watched the boats and ate ice cream at a place near the marina. Ren was 14 months by then, toddling and opinionated, and she fell asleep in the backseat both days before we got back to the house. Melissa and I sat on the back porch in the evenings after Ren was down and talked in the way we hadn't talked in years. About her father. About the years I'd worked and she'd been in school, and we'd both been so busy being capable that we'd forgotten to just be present with each other. It wasn't fixed. I want to be honest about that. Families aren't things you repair once, and then they stay repaired. There was still a wariness between us, a careful quality to how we moved around certain subjects. Connor was polite, but not warm. Patricia would still be the one they called first. But I had stopped waiting. I was painting on Tuesday nights with Sylvie and Gwen, and my watercolors were bad in an increasingly interesting way. I was filling the bird feeder. I'd started doing that again in April, and the chickadees had found it by May. I was driving down to Toronto when I was wanted and staying home when I wasn't, and both felt like choices I was making rather than sentences I was serving. My husband used to say that the bravest thing a person could do was need less. I thought I understood that when he said it. I understand it differently now. He didn't mean deprive yourself. He meant stop making your whole self dependent on what someone else is willing to give you. Stop building your foundation on another person's floor. I'm 71 years old. I live alone in a small bungalow in Barrie. My granddaughter knows my face and reaches for me when she sees me. My daughter and I are, very slowly, learning how to know each other again. That is enough. That is actually enough. Some mornings I sit at the kitchen table where the envelope used to be, and I drink my tea and I look out at the backyard. The bird feeder is full. The maple next door has gone fully red and then fully bare, and now the new leaves are starting to come in, pale and uncertain, the way new things always are. I don't wait anymore. I just live. I've thought a lot about what Ren did when she saw me walk into that room. She raised both arms. She didn't know anything about the note in the envelope, or the 11 days I'd left it sitting on the kitchen table, or the drive down the 400 in a coat I'd bought when I still had a reason to dress well for work. She just saw my face and reached for me. There's something in that I keep coming back to. The way things unfolded with Melissa didn't happen by accident. I spent years building something. Not resentfully, not with conditions attached, but genuinely, and then I spent a few more years slowly disappearing into the edges of her life, telling myself that was fine, telling myself that was what love required. It wasn't fine. And what I eventually understood, sitting in that car on the way home, was that the disappearing hadn't been love at all. It had been fear dressed up as generosity. Doing the right thing. Showing up for your children, giving what you have, being present when it's hard, those things matter. I don't regret any of it. But doing the right thing doesn't protect you from being taken for granted. That's not a cynical observation, it's just true. The protection comes from something else, from knowing your own worth clearly enough that you don't need someone else to confirm it. Melissa had stopped confirming it, and I had let that become the whole story. What changed wasn't her. She's still learning. We both are. What changed was that I stopped outsourcing the question of whether I deserved to be there. Sitting on that floor in my pearl earrings, playing with a 1-year-old who reached for me without hesitation, that took something. Not courage in any dramatic sense. More like the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't make a sound. I could have stayed home. I could have waited for the invitation that fit the size she'd decided I was. I chose not to. And that choice came from a clarity I'd had to work for. Slowly, the way you work for anything that's actually yours. Heloise used to say that wisdom isn't knowing what to do. It's knowing what you've already survived and trusting yourself because of it. I've buried a husband. I've worked 30 years and raised a daughter largely on my own, and paid for things I was never asked to pay for because I wanted her life to be easier than mine. I know what I'm made of. I just forgot, for a while, to act like it. The watercolor class, the revised will, the drive down in April, none of it was revenge. All of it was reclamation. I was taking back the parts of my life I'd quietly handed over without realizing it, and doing it not with anger but with the kind of steady, deliberate intention that my husband would have recognized and approved of. Ren will grow up. She'll understand things about her grandmother that Melissa hasn't yet. Or maybe Melissa will get there too. Either way, I'll be here, painting badly on Tuesday nights, filling the bird feeder, having tea with Sylvie, driving down to Toronto when I'm wanted, and building something worth returning to when I'm not. That's all any of us can do, really. Build something worth returning to.